My name is Gloria. I am 63 years old today, but I want to take you back to when I was only 7. That's when I stopped being a little girl and became a prisoner in my own home. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky. Back then, everyone knew everyone. People smiled at church, waved from porches, and whispered when they didn't like what they saw. But no one ever dared to look too closely inside our home. No one ever asked why I was so quiet, or why I flinched when my brothers got too close. I had 3 older brothers, and a father who believed women were nothing but burdens. My mother? She was a shadow. She cooked, cleaned, and obeyed. But she never protected me, not even once. The abuse began when I was 7. One of my brothers would come into my room at night. At first, I didn't even know what was happening. I just remember crying. I remember whispering to the walls. I remember bleeding, and no one did a thing. I tried to tell my mother once. I whispered what he'd done while she was peeling potatoes. Her hand froze. She turned slowly toward me and slapped me so hard, I saw white. Then she said, "Don't ever speak of such filth again. You want your father to kill you?" And that was that. I stopped speaking, stopped playing, stopped dreaming. I lived in silence. My childhood, it belonged to them. By the time I was 15, the abuse had become a routine. I wasn't even surprised anymore, just numb. But the worst was still ahead. One day, I missed my period, then another. I didn't understand what was happening until my body began to change. I was pregnant, and I knew exactly who the father was. I hid it for as long as I could. I wore baggy clothes, avoided mirrors, but eventually my mother saw my belly. Her face twisted into something I'll never forget. Rage, fear, disgust, all at once. She told my father. That night, he came into the room with his belt. He beat me until I couldn't stand. He screamed, "You're a whore! You're filthy! You've brought shame to this family!" But he never asked who had done it, because deep down, I think he knew. They sent me away, to a home for girls run by a religious group. It was a cold, cruel place where they shaved my head and made me pray for forgiveness every day. I gave birth to a little boy in silence. They took him away before I could hold him. I never saw him again. They told me he'd be adopted by a better family, better than me, better than the broken, beaten girl they blamed for everything. I returned home a shell of who I'd been, and still the abuse continued. It was a Tuesday morning when I made the decision. I went upstairs, opened a dusty suitcase, and packed only what I needed: some clothes, a few old letters, a photo of my son, the one I never got to raise, but whose face I'd tracked down years later through a search agency. I never contacted him. I never dared, but I kept his photo near me always. Then I walked out the door. I didn't say goodbye to the house, or the life, or the ghosts inside it. I took the bus to the city and stayed with my daughter for a month while I figured things out. It was the first time I'd ever had a room with a lock I owned. The first time I slept through the night without fear. I started therapy, learned about trauma, learned that I wasn't weak, that I had survived something monstrous. And slowly, I began to heal. I started painting. I joined a small community group of women over 50 who were learning to start new lives. I met another woman, her name was Clara, who had escaped an abusive marriage at 55. We laughed, we cried, we shared stories no one else wanted to hear. And for the first time, I felt seen. Now I'm 63. I live in a small apartment filled with plants and art and warm light. Every morning, I open my window and say out loud, "This day is mine." I cook for joy, not duty. I dance to music in my living room. I write letters to myself that begin with, "Dear Gloria, I am proud of you." I volunteer at a women's shelter now. I tell them they are not alone. I tell them it's never too late. I tell them I was 60 when I finally said, "Enough." And now I'm saying it to you, to anyone listening. You are not what they did to you. You are not the silence they forced on you. You are not too old to start again. You are not too broken to be whole. I lost everything, my childhood, my voice, my baby, my hope. But now, I have myself. And that is everything. When I was 20, a man came to the house. He was older, quiet, and owned a small farm. My father said I would marry him, that it was time I stopped being a burden. I didn't argue. What was the point? His name was Harold. He wasn't violent, but he wasn't kind either. He treated me like furniture, something useful, not lovable. I cooked, I cleaned, I gave him 3 daughters. And for a while, I told myself this was better. At least no one was hurting me at night. At least I had a kitchen to call mine. But the silence inside me never healed. The grief never left. I watched my daughters grow, and I swore to myself every day, they will never live what I lived. They will never be touched the way I was touched, not while I'm alive. And I kept that promise. I protected them with everything I had, but I didn't protect myself. Not once. Harold died suddenly when I was 53, a heart attack in the middle of the field. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything at all. By then, our daughters were grown. One had moved to California, one was teaching in Chicago, and the youngest had started her own business in town. And me? I was just alone. I stayed in that cold house, wore the same apron, walked the same creaky floorboards. I'd become a ghost of a woman who never got to live her own life. Then, one day, my oldest daughter came to visit. She sat across the table and looked me in the eye and said, "Mom, do you ever think about leaving?" I laughed. "Leave? Where would I go?" She took my hand. "Anywhere, anywhere you want. You're free now." Free. It didn't feel real. I had never been free, not for a single day. But that word haunted me. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying my life in my head. All the stolen years, all the bruises, the lies, the silence. And I realized something that made me sob for hours. I had spent 60 years living everyone else's life, not mine.